Well, let's start with that transgender issue, transgender rights so-called, because this comes to your most recent podcast, which is, when I listened to it, that was the reason I thought I'll email you and get you on, because it was a very disturbing conversation, I thought, with Kellie-Jay Keen, or Posy Parker, the woman who's really conducting a brave fight for women's right to speak, essentially. It's nothing more than that. And we would know she was in Australia recently and New Zealand, and the behaviour of the transgender crowd was just appalling, violent, threatening. Tell me, we should send people to listen to your podcast with her to hear just how frightening it was, but she genuinely felt her life was at risk, didn't she, when she was up there in Auckland and the crowd broke through without any police in sight?
Absolutely, she really did. And I should say I've been friends with Kellie-Jay Keen for a few years now. I have a lot of admiration for her. I think the depiction of her as a far-right Nazi anti-trans lunatic is so completely wrong. Anyone who knows her or who has spoken to her knows that that is completely wrong. She is a woman who believes in women's rights, who believes that women need their own spaces in certain situations, and who particularly believes that women should have the right to speak about themselves and their bodies and their needs without being called transphobic or bigoted and so on. So I think she's right on all of that. And she did genuinely fear for her life when she was in Auckland, and anyone who's seen that footage will have just been deeply disturbed by it. I wrote a piece for The Spectator here just saying that this is what it must have been like when women were marched to the stake 500 years ago. You know, there would have been baying mobs screaming at them and calling them the devil and shouting expletives in their face, throwing things at them. That's what happened to Kellie-Jay Keen in Auckland. It was like a witch being marched away, but mercifully, she was marched into a police car rather than to the stake. It was really disturbing. The thing that worries me most, and this does touch on Australia as well as New Zealand, is that I think that mob situation was actually, the conditions for it were set by a lot of mainstream Australian journalists, a lot of mainstream Australian politicians who went along with the idea that this woman was a Nazi, this woman is basically the scum of the earth. One of the Greens in the Parliament in Hobart referred to her as a turd. He said we shouldn't call them TERFs, which means trans-exclusionary radical feminist. We should call them turds, which means trans-exclusionary right-wing dropkicks. That was Nick McKim of the Greens who said that. And of course, the reason he chose the acronym TERDS is because it sounds like feces. It sounds like excrement. He was basically saying this woman is excrement. And there was a lot of that going on. There was a lot of that demonization of her by people who should know better, which means by the time she got to Auckland, people thought, God, we have to deal with this Nazi. She's a real danger. She's the most horrible woman in the Southern Hemisphere right now. And so the mob was whipped up by mainstream actors and mainstream voices. And that's the part of this that actually worries me the most.